Chapter 32. 7. Reyes awoke to the familiar sound of a bird singing somewhere nearby. It was the same sound every morning, and Reyes was convinced it was the same bird. Something wasn't right about this morning. Usually when he woke up he'd be able to feel Gaggara next to him. Invariably one of her arms would be draped across him, and she would be snuggled up close to him so that he could feel her breath on his skin. Feeling concerned, Reyes reached across to Gaggara's side of the hut, and found only the straw that she should have been lying on. Gaggara herself was missing. Reyes began to feel quite worried. He quickly cast a cat's-sight spell on himself, so that he would be able to see if maybe she was just doing something in another part of the hut. She wasn't. He was alone. He had been living with Gaggara for more than 6 months now, and never before had he woken up to find her missing. He was beginning to feel quite concerned. The cat's-sight spell enabled the recipient to make better use of the available light. It was an ideal spell for casting on a dark night, but casting it in the morning and then venturing out into the sunlight was generally considered to be a bad idea. As Reyes emerged from the hut, everything was too bright. The colours all seemed washed out, and even when the sun was behind him he felt as if it was shining right in his eyes. He stood at the entrance to the hut for a few minutes, unable to see much of anything. In an attempt to keep out the extra light, he tried closing his eyes. He felt helpless as he stood there with his eyes closed, wishing that Manglos had taught him a spell to counter the effects. "Are you feeling all right, handsome?" someone asked. Reyes couldn't see her, but he recognized her voice easily. That was Gaggara's voice. Thanks in part to spending so much time in the company of Harpies, but most of all to Gaggara's patient teachings, Reyes no longer had any trouble understanding or speaking the Harpy language. "I'll be fine," Reyes replied. He turned his head in her direction and tried to look at her. She seemed to be a lot thinner than he remembered, though this probably owed more to the light trying to seep around the sides of her form than it did to any diet that Gaggara might have been on. "It will pass in an hour or so." "Good," Gaggara sounded concerned. "Why weren't you in the hut?" Reyes asked. "I couldn't sleep," Gaggara replied. "It's my birthday today. I'm 7 years old now." "Congratulations," Reyes told her. "One more year to go until you're recognised as a huntress." It had been barely a month since Reyes had also celebrated his 7th birthday. He remembered waking up to the day and wondering if Gaggara had bought him a present. He had been a little upset when he discovered that the giving of presents was something that apparently only humans did. Nevertheless, he hadn't dwelt on the fact, and Gaggara had spent the entire day with him and let him make all the decisions as to what they should do that day. "Once I passed my rite of passage," Gaggara agreed happily. "Actually, I was just seeing Manif off on hers. We were both born on the same day, only I was born 1 year later." "Maybe I should go and wish her luck as well," Roy suggested. "You'll be too late," Gaggara stated. "She's already left. She'll be back in a week, if she survives." Survives? Reyes was horrified, though perhaps it was the thought that next year Gaggara would be wanting to go through it, rather than his concern for the life of a Harpy he had never even heard of before today. Just what does the rite of passage entail? "Oh, it's simple really," Gaggara said. "The young hopeful has to venture into the wild and live alone for a week. She's supposed to make herself a suitable shelter and hunt her own food with nothing more than a single weapon that she's allowed to take with her. It's usually a spear. Traditionally, upon completion of the rite, the huntress, as she would then have the right to be called, brings back a kill for the rest of her village. The bigger the kill, the higher her standing is likely to be in the village, and the better her chance of being selected to visit the male." "I see," Reyes said. Actually, as rites of passage went, it didn't sound all that arduous to him. Then he declared, "Well, birthday girl, today is your day. What would you like to do?" Gaggara smiled at him. At least Reyes thought she was smiling at him. He still couldn't see her all that clearly. She then took his head gently in her hands and bit him just lightly on the end of his nose. "I thought I might pay a visit to my mother's barracks." "That's a good idea," Reyes agreed. He wished he had had the opportunity to speak to his mother on his birthday just over a month ago. Last he had heard, she was still at the King's Palace in First Town. A girl should speak to her mother on her birthday. Actually, it wasn't unusual for Gaggara to want to visit her mother on any day. She was often flying off to the barracks for that purpose, and there had been occasions when her mother had come to visit Gaggara in Harpy town. Reyes remembered one such visit well. It was the day they had enlisted Gaggara's mother to teach him how to fly. Also, Gaggara's frequent visits to her mother had been ideal times for Reyes to get away and see Jorvis. "Ideally, I'd like you to come with me today," Gaggara commented. "Really?" Reyes said. Never before had Gaggara asked him to accompany her when visiting her mother. "I'd be delighted." Gaggara grabbed him about the neck and hugged him close. "Thank you," she declared. "I have some very important news I'd like to tell you both." "News?" Reyes was suddenly very worried. The only thing he could think of that would be so important for Gaggara to tell her mother was that she might be with child. He felt he should be overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a father, but he was only 7, and he wasn't sure he was ready to handle the responsibility. "Yes," she replied. She suddenly seemed very affectionate, taking his left ear between her teeth and biting it gently. For a moment, Reyes even considered pushing her off him. Surely she shouldn't be acting so amorous if he was pregnant. But then, he couldn't resist her. He loved her too much. He took her in his arms and held her tightly. "I love you," he intoned. "We should go," Gaggara commented, and she took a step back, spoiling the mood. Reyes let her go and looked at her admiringly from about an arm's length. His vision was a lot clearer than it had been, although the spell was still in effect. His eyes were slowly getting used to all the extra light. He couldn't help but think about the possibility that he might soon be a father. He had to remind himself that he was living in a Harpy society. Here, when a female got pregnant, the male rarely played a part in either the development or the life of that baby, at least until she reached an age where she could have children herself. The baby would be brought up communally by all the females in the village, but mainly by her mother and grandmother. The baby's father wouldn't even get a look in. Reyes was certain that when his child was born, he would want to take a more active role than was traditional for a male Harpy. Reyes had never been to the barracks of the Hope before. He wasn't all that impressed with what he saw as he came into land just outside the compound's gate. Then again, he wasn't all that surprised either. The Hope consisted mainly of ex-slaves and rejects, and their barracks tended to reflect that status. The large wooden dormitories in which they slept looked as if they were infested with woodworm and rot, and would collapse if someone should so much as sneeze in their general direction. It wasn't surprising that most of the soldiers of the Hope would rather be gathered outside in the open, rather than in a barrack house that looked like it might collapse at any moment. What Reyes did find surprising was the apparent lack of discipline. There was a drill ground and a training ground, archery targets, and even an assault course, and though all these things were in use, there seemed to be no rhyme or reason as to how they were used. Mainly, it was the Harpies that were gathered around the archery targets. A Minotaur was giving some lessons on hand-to-hand fighting in the part of the compound set aside for training. It was most strange to see people of several different races gaining instructions from a Minotaur and treating each other as equals. Likewise, the drill ground was scattered with several small groups, each consisting of a variety of races. Generally speaking, they were just standing around chatting, or, as in one case, playing some kind of simple game with a small ball. There were 2 guards on the gates of the barracks, a Minotaur and a Goblin. The burn marks on the wrists of the Goblin and the branding on the bare arm of the Minotaur suggested that they had both at one time been slaves. The Goblin also bore a tattoo, though it wasn't the Lagnoth loyalty tattoo that he had seen on other goblins. The Minotaur was armed with a huge axe, the blade of which had turned almost totally brown with rust. Reyes saw this as an indication that the equipment given to those in the Hope was no better than the housing. Likewise, the Goblin was armed with little more than a short sword tucked into his belt because he had no scabbard. Rust had eaten away a large chunk of the metal over time. Neither of the guards seemed to pay any attention to either Reyes or Gaggara as the two approached the compound. The guards stood there lazily, gazing into space, and for all Reyes could tell might as well have been asleep on their feet. As soon as he and Gaggara tried to cross the threshold, though, the Minotaur suddenly became very animated and stepped in front of them. "What is your business here?" the Minotaur asked. Then he changed his tune. "Oh, "Hello, Gaggara. Here to visit with your mother again?" For a moment, Reyes was surprised just how fluently the Minotaur spoke the elven tongue. Then he realised it made sense for a slave to be able to communicate with its masters. "I am," Gaggara replied. She didn't seem even slightly menaced by the huge size of the creature standing in front of her. "Krishnok," the Minotaur called over to the goblin. "Any idea where Lagnoth is?" The goblin seemed to suddenly wake up and turn his attention towards the Minotaur. Now, Reyes had grown up in a world where, when depicted in plays, certain creatures were always given certain types of voices. In these plays, goblins were always given nasty little nasal voices that made them sound very adenoidal. This goblin's voice fitted that stereotype perfectly.
"Which Lagnoth? I know two of them."
"Gaggara's mother," the Minotaur clarified. He pointed to Gaggara standing in front of him, trying to make his intent as clear as possible.
"Oh, hello, Gaggara,"
Krishnok said happily by way of greeting. "Hello, Krishnok," Gaggara echoed.
"Who's your friend?"
Krishnok asked. "My boyfriend," Gaggara replied. Krishnok seemed happy with that answer.
"The last time I saw your mother, she was over by the fire pits cooking. She's probably still there."
"Everyone here seems to know you," Reyes commented as they walked across the compound. His point was illustrated by some of those gathered about the drill ground, waving to Gaggara as she walked past. "I come here a lot," Gaggara replied simply. "I don't know everyone, though." She indicated a couple of elves that were walking past. One of the elves was clearly leading the other, and from the designs on his uniform it was clear that the one leading was some sort of very high-ranking officer. The other one, though subservient to the first, was still wearing a very fancy uniform, suggesting that he was also of quite a high rank. "Only elves can be officers, though not all elves are officers," Gaggara explained. She waved her hand over at a gathering of elves that all wore the same drab uniform as most of the other races present. The elf in charge here goes by the name Dragonman Fenert, and her assistant, as you see there, is Wormman Frayne. "Dragonman? Wormman?" Reyes said incredulously. The words were clearly of elven derivation. "Those are their ranks," Gaggara explained. She continued on across the parade ground towards the fire pits. "Dragonman is quite a high rank, but there are higher. Emperor's Man, for example. Though I believe there's only the one Emperor's Man. She controls the entire army. A Dragonman only controls a regiment." "I see," Reyes commented as he followed her. "Be very careful around her," Gaggara informed him. "She hates anyone and everyone who wasn't born Elvish." "Just her, then, and about 90% of the elven population," Reyes replied. "Well, yes," Gaggara intoned, "but this one is in charge of a regiment of non-elves." Reyes watched the two elves for a few more seconds. Then one of them looked his way, and suddenly he felt he should cast his eyes elsewhere. He followed Gaggara the rest of the way to the fire pits. Fire pits seemed to be a staple requirement of Harpies everywhere. In this case, the Harpies of the Hope had requisitioned a small section of grass wasteland that stood just behind the rows of barracks. If Reyes knew Harpies the way he thought he did, he felt that it was more than likely that they had done so without first garnering permission from the elves in charge. In most villages, and indeed in the part of Harpy town that considered itself free of all that village nonsense, cooking would be a task given to the youngest among the Harpies. In the Hope compound, though, there was no one of such a tender age, and so all the huntresses had to take it in turns to cook the meat. Today it was the turn of Gaggara's mother to be one of those doing the cooking. Another thing Reyes noticed as he approached the fire pit was that the only ones making use of the food available were themselves Harpies. There might be a general feeling of live and let live about the compound, as members of several different races gathered together to tell each other stories and jokes, and to practice their skills. That attitude apparently didn't stretch to food. For one thing, the different races likely had different nutritional needs. Nevertheless, it definitely felt as if no one other than a Harpy was willing to eat the food that a Harpy had caught and killed. There were only 5 Harpies working the fire pit, all sporting the brown armbands and wearing the skirts emblazoned with the motto 421. Lagnoth was busy turning a spit that held the remains of a large pig. The head of the pig was still obvious, although most of the rest of the beast had already been stripped of its meat. The Harpy that greeted the two wasn't Lagnoth, though. She wore the same armband and skirt as the others, but there was an extra mark on both. At most, Reyes felt she couldn't be more than 13 or 14 years old, and yet she seemed to be in charge at the fire pits. The others there certainly seemed to treat her as their superior. Perhaps what caught Reyes's eye most was that this harpy seemed to be wearing what looked like a pair of human index fingers hanging on a thread about her neck. "Hello, Gaggara," this harpy said. "Good to see you again. Come to join us this time?" "I don't think so," Reyes said, a little surprised that she would ask. Gaggara grinned. She hugged Reyes tightly and said, "This is Chargeman Agnart, my mother's immediate superior. Chargeman is the highest rank any non-elf can hold." "Agnart," Reyes repeated to himself. For a moment he felt his blood run cold. The mention of her name reminded him of his old language teacher. Obviously this wasn't the same woman. That Agnart would have to be nearly twice as old as the girl in front of him. "Pleased to meet you." He offered his hand to the harpy. Agnart looked at the hand, seeming to be unsure as to what she was supposed to do with it. In the end, Reyes let his hand drop back to his side. Gaggara made her way over to where her mother was. "Good to see you again, Mother." "Daughter!" Lagnoth responded gleefully. "It's always good to see you and your mail. Has she started to collect any others yet, or is it still just you?" "Just me, Mother," Gaggara told her. Gaggara's mother sounded disapproving. "Well, she's still young yet. Has she gotten you pregnant yet?" This was it, Reyes thought to himself. The moment at which Gaggara tells her mother that she's pregnant. He braced himself for the announcement. "Not yet, Mother," Gaggara said, "although it's not for lack of trying." "I'll bet," Lagnoth stated. Hold on a moment, Reyes thought to himself. She's not pregnant? What was going on? So, what was that important news you wanted to share with your mother? Well, Gaggara looked at him, the expression on her face relatively doleful. I intend to join the Hope. You what? Reyes said, shocked. We had that tax assessor around last week, remember? He said a new tax on us living there. We now have to pay more to live there than my mother earns. I have no choice. If I join the Hope, then they'll have to find a billet for me here, free of charge. I have some money, Reyes told her. He still had the money he had gotten for the horse, and the 2 silver slivers he had brought from home, none of which he had found the need to spend since he had met Gaggara. And how long would that last us? Gaggara asked. I've made up my mind. I'm joining the Hope. I'm 7 years old now, and it's time I took my place as a warrior, even if I'm not yet a huntress. You won't be a huntress until you turn 8, dear, Lagnoth told her. Lagnoth didn't look at her daughter when she spoke. Instead, she kept her eyes on the half-roasted pig that sat on the spit in front of her. Age is unimportant, Agnart declared. She may join us if she wishes. We'll be glad to have her. We have no age restrictions in the Hope. Gaggara turned to Reyes again, her eyes imploring him. I want to join the Hope. I need to join the Hope. My mother is here. My only alternative is to leave the city. Agnart pointed to a small office near the gates. If you truly wish to join us, that's the hut you need to go to. The recruiting officer will walk you through the enlistment process, and then send you to the quartermaster for your uniform and equipment. It shouldn't take you too long to go through the procedure. Then we can officially welcome you to the Hope and find you a billet. Please, Gaggara, don't, Reyes said humbly. I must, Gaggara insisted. I have no choice. Don't worry, I'll be quite safe, and I'll still be yours. Why don't you join too? Then we can stay together. You won't be able to afford to stay in the hut alone anyway. Reyes could hardly believe that Gaggara was even suggesting that he join. It had only been a couple of months ago that they had gotten into an argument over his simple desire to get in a little bit of target practice. He had wanted to fire some arrows at one of the practice targets without the aid of his bracelets, and Gaggara had protested because she thought it was tantamount to hunting, and to her mind, males weren't supposed to hunt. Now she wanted him to join the army. Can't you see? Reyes pressed. The Hope is little more than... He hesitated to use the word suicide squad in front of Gaggara's mother. Lagnoth evidently guessed where he was heading, though, because she interrupted him with, whatever uniform we might be wearing, we are Harpies. We fly above the battle and the corpses of our brethren to attack from the relative safety of height. Don't worry about my daughter. She'll be quite safe. and out of range of the enemy arrows. Thank you, Mother, Gaggara replied gleefully. Gaggara evidently considered her mother's comment as approval for her to enlist. What? Agnark commented to Reyes. You didn't seriously think that we'd be willing to lay down our lives for the sake of keeping a few elves alive, did you? Please, handsome, Gaggara requested. Give me your blessing too. Reyes hesitated again. He still had reasons why Gaggara shouldn't join the Hope, but they were reasons he couldn't voice, reasons that involved the girl he loved, taking up arms against his family. I love you, Gaggara, he said, and then in a moment of weakness he said, Of course you may join the Hope, if that is what you truly wish. I'd be overjoyed if you would join too, Gaggara added eagerly. We don't have any males, Agnark said. There's nothing that says a male can't join us, but you won't be given any preferential treatment. You'll take your turn cooking and hunting like the rest of us. She's male, Lagnoth said. We'll have to teach her from scratch. Actually, Gaggara commented, I've seen her handle a bow. She's not all that bad. I am better, of course, but for a male. Then that's settled, Agnark declared. Hold on, Reyes protested. Not so fast. This is my decision and I won't have it made for me. Reyes could think of so many reasons why he shouldn't join the Hope. He could think of many of them off the top of his head, yet they all paled into insignificance when compared with the threat of never seeing Gaggara again. One thing that did bother him about joining the Hope was that he wouldn't get to see much of Jorvis anymore. He might still be able to get away occasionally, but he wouldn't be able to count on it. Then again, being a member of the elven armed forces would enable Reyes to watch over Gaggara in battle. What was more, with the impending invasion coming, it would give him a way back into Florith. Maybe he'd get to see his family again, maybe even help them escape the clutches of the evil elves. Maybe I'll join a little later, Reyes finally suggested. He needed to let the spy know that he wouldn't be around quite as much anymore. I need to do a few things first. For one, I have to go and fetch my own weapons. He bent down and picked up a warped-looking bow that was resting on the ground next to Lagnoth's stall. If this is anything to go by, I wouldn't last 5 minutes unless I used my own stuff. Gaggara leaned across, and this time she kissed him, saying, Thank you, handsome. I'll wait for you by the hut, and we can join up together. That way we should get adjacent beds. Maybe you could fetch my pretties while you're at the hut. I will, Reyes assured her.